Hello everyone, it's Madame Macabre, aka Katie O'Laughlin, and today I'm going to be sharing with you the first 3 episodes of my new web novel, Reapers the Deathly Messenger, in audiobook format. If you like what you hear, and you would like to continue on with the story, I highly recommend hopping over to Kindle Vella and checking it out. I'll put the link in the description below. Episode 1. Night Terror. It was a chilly September night when Grace stirred from a restless sleep. There wasn't any particular reason as to why. She poked her head through the neighboring door to see if perhaps her roommate was having the same troubles with sleep. But no, she dozed perfectly undisturbed in the silky moonlight that spilled through the old satin drapes. It appeared that she alone was awake at this hour. Not a sound or threat to be detected. Grace stood silently in the doorway, pondering for the reason she had awoken. All the while her roommate Marnie was nothing more than a rumpled mass beneath the quilts, peacefully rising and falling in rhythm. In a nearly dreamlike state, Grace felt compelled to work her way out to the living room. She glided over to the old bay window that gazed out upon the wooded courtyard below. With steady fingers, she undid the knot in the tattered ribbon that held the curtains shut tight and tugged them open. She watched noiselessly as they drifted apart, revealing the crisp night air beyond. There was nothing there, just the dark courtyard filled with the dancing shadows of the surrounding trees. Well, what else did she expect? She was acting rather crazy in the first place. Something Grace feared was happening more and more often as of late. But just as she began to turn back toward her bed, something shifted in her peripheral vision. Instinctively, Grace whipped her head back to try and catch a glimpse. Something was moving through the courtyard. It was very tall and had a slender frame. Extremely long black hair draped across its face and fluttered in the night breeze. It took long, purposeful strides as it entered the courtyard from a nearby thicket. The thing paused for a moment and peered over its shoulder before resuming the trek across the courtyard. As it neared the old apartment complex, the creature crossed under a bead of light thrown down by one of the rusting iron street lamps bolted onto the exterior. Grace had to stifle a gasp as she gazed down. What met her eyes appeared to be a strange young man. But no, that wasn't right. Grace quickly felt herself becoming unnerved. Something was horribly off about this ominous figure. It took a moment for it to fully register before a crippling knot sank in her stomach like lead. It was his eyes. They were like nothing she'd ever seen before. Where there should have been whites to the eyes, there were none. Instead, his glossy scleras were a deep pitch black, devoid of warmth or humanity. In perfect and terrifying contrast, his irises were a jolting electric blue, refracting light in a predatory manner. Though the specter's haunting eyes were frightening enough, they weren't nearly the worst part to behold. That grim honor belonged to the macabre thing it clutched in its slender, spindly fingers. The sight made Grace's blood run cold. It appeared to be some sort of long, ominous tool. It was as dark as the surrounding void of night, nearly impossible to fully see. But Grace was actually grateful for this. Something primal in her gut told her she didn't want to truly see it. Just the murky outline alone was enough to make something in the innermost corners of her being shriek in existential terror, as if her very survival instincts. She wanted nothing more than to tear her gaze away, but Grace willed herself to keep her eyes on the monstrous figure. At that moment, the young man, or whatever it was, froze in its tracks. Grace's throat caught, and she held her breath in horror. It seemed as if the thing had sensed her very gaze upon it, and in response, darted its own gaze up through the window. Breaking through her constricting terror, Grace threw herself onto the cold hardwood floor below. She lay there for several minutes, the sound of thundering heartbeats flooding her ears. By the time her pulse had quieted, she wheeled herself slowly off of the floor. What was that thing? Had it seen her? She thanked her lucky stars under shaky breaths that she hadn't turned any of her lights on. Perhaps the creature hadn't seen her after all? Perhaps... Wait, what was she saying? There was no way any of this actually happened. She's tired, practically sleepwalking. Her mind probably just pieced together bushes and dark shadows outside into familiar shapes. Pareidolia was far more likely an explanation than literal monsters running about. She was being ridiculous. Regardless, she couldn't shake off that deep-seated trembling in her core caused by looking at that strange instrument. No, not an instrument, a shadow. She was being silly. She would go right back over to the window, look out, and there would be nothing there. That's right, nice and easy, just over to the windsill. Grace shivered in anticipation, as if about to jump into an icy pool, before finally willing herself to look. Eyes bulging, she scanned for anything out of the ordinary. But wouldn't you know it, there was nothing. Grace breathed a sigh of relief at the sight of the vast emptiness that laid before her. There wasn't anything to be seen in the old courtyard except for a few fallen leaves tumbling solemnly in the icy wind. No monsters, no strange tools, and certainly no inky black eyes. It was almost funny. Just what exactly was she expecting to see? This whole thing was mad. Junior year away at college was really taking its toll on Grace. It seemed as though the year had only just begun, but the late nights, early mornings, and heavy course load of high-level classes was already making her see things. How was she going to survive all of it? Slowly, Grace got back to her feet and began to fumble with the ribbon again, attempting to tie the heavy floor-length curtains back into place. And then, for good measure, she yanked down the old screen behind them. The more layers between her and whatever was out there, the better. Or whatever wasn't out there. There she went again with the paranoia. When Marnie wakes in the morning, she'd no doubt find it curious. The two almost never pulled that dusty old screen down. Grace would have to craft some excuse if she mentioned it. After all, Marnie had better things to worry about than her neurotic best friend's mental breakdown. Despite still being rather shaken up, Grace's body felt extremely heavy. She had been struggling with sleep for a while now, and it was finally catching up to her. Silently, she drifted back into her room, taking care not to disturb Marnie. She took a moment to yank her own heavy curtains shut as well before finally collapsing onto her bed. She rolled to her side and gazed across to the wall that connected her and Marnie's rooms. She could just make out the faintest sound of steady breathing. Grace shifted with a disgruntled sigh. She was quite envious of Marnie's ability to get such restful sleep night after night. Rolling back to her other side and finally settling in, Grace wondered if she would even remember the strange incident the following morning. Episode 2. Marnie and Me. "Get up, you bum!" A playful voice wrenched Grace back to consciousness. "Your alarm has been going off for the past 5 minutes, and I have no idea how to turn it off." Releasing a pathetic groan, Grace reached a grasping hand out toward the bedside table and forcefully slammed the off button on the blaring alarm. Upon doing so, she promptly crumpled back into a heap on her pillows once more. "What's this? Don't tell me Miss Perfect 4.0 is gonna play hooky today. And on the day of our psych midterm, no less. Is the world ending?" "What?" Grace spat, shooting bolt upright from her bed. "Seriously?" quipped Marnie, rolling her eyes. "You were up for hours last night studying for it. I swear, girl, a major space cadet like you should have majored in astronomy." "Oh, crap, you're right. The test. Wow, okay, you're gonna have to cut me some slack on that one. Let me tell you, I had the weirdest dream last night. I feel like a total wreck," Grace whined as she climbed out of bed, shooting a pathetic glance in Marnie's direction. As usual, Marnie was simply radiant. Ever since Grace had first met her best friend in the 7th grade, she swore the woman was some kind of goddess. She was truly a stunning person, both inside and out. Marnie had a deep olive complexion that glowed like sunlight against her silky, shoulder-length chestnut curls, and the most striking hazel eyes. At age 20, Marnie Blackwood was the eldest of 5 siblings. Perhaps this is where she had cultivated her kindness and patience. Her brothers and sisters were all quite a bit younger than her, having come from her father's second marriage. Both he and her stepmother were highly skilled attorneys and owned several homes across the West Coast. However, the one place that Marnie truly considered home was their large manor in the Queen Anne area. She was a city girl, born and raised on the Seattle coast. Grace, meanwhile, was quite a different story. She adored Marnie like the sister she never had growing up, but Marnie was a hard act to follow. Like a sister, yes, but Marnie was more like the popular, trendy, incredibly hard to compete with sister. Not to say that Grace ever begrudged her for it, though. Marnie was one of those rare people, so genuinely kind and generous, it wasn't possible for a decent human being to harbor resentment for her. However, as Grace walked over to the floor-length mirror to the left of her closet, she felt the pings of insecurity prickle under her skin. By no means was Grace an unattractive girl. She had a pretty face with dainty soft features and a formidable bust, but her complexion sorely lacked the exuberant glow present on Marnie. If she were being truly honest, it was actually more like she practically mirrored a corpse, with her porcelain pale skin and slight dark circles beginning to form under her silvery gray eyes. Grace Nightingale was the 20-year-old only child of a small-town family. Her father taught at the local high school and her mother was a nurse at the elementary school. They lived in a charming old farmhouse in the rolling hills of the Ording Valley. Although Grace felt a great deal of comfort in her hometown, she was also well aware of how small and sheltered it was, and as a result, had always longed to get away to the city. That's why when it finally came time for her to choose a university, she chose to go right into the heart of Seattle. It was a big change for her. At first, she had started to develop cold feet when confronted with the thoughts of needing to go to a new city all alone. Grace had always been quite introverted and therefore was slow to make new friends. But upon receiving the news that Marnie had also been accepted and that they could make plans to share an apartment together, Grace's anxieties instantly quelled. The two had first met during their high school years at a conference for young achievers. Grace had initially been distant when first grouped with the boisterous extrovert, but, as Marnie would soon become infamous for, her unyielding will and friendliness ultimately smashed through Grace's defensive walls like a battering ram, and the two were soon fast friends. Grace sighed and looked away from her reflection. Shooting a glance towards Marnie and the cute designer romper she was sporting for the day, Grace sighed and pulled her oversized sweater dress on. Lazily, she gave her waist-length raven hair a tug with her brush before deeming it good enough. Marnie had actually been the one to pick that particular dress out. Grace wasn't really all that interested in keeping up with trends, but Marnie so enjoyed helping her with shopping that she just couldn't bring herself to object. After all, if it had been up to Grace alone, she'd be living in nothing but hoodies. At least now she had some variety. And Grace had to admit that Marnie knew what she was doing. The garment really brought out her eyes. She leaned in closer to get a better look. Ugh, okay. Well, she could definitely do better with a little more sleep and a few less dark circles. Stepping back from the mirror, Grace peered down at her clock. It was nearly time for them to head out. With a slightly quickened pace, she reached for her messenger bag. Carefully, she dug out all of her computer science books and replaced them with a single psychology text and her binder. Grace had always had a way with computers. Ever since she was a child, she was the one her parents would turn to when they needed help with something technology-related. It wasn't until she was older that she realized just how gifted she was at it. Deciding to pursue her talent, Grace chose to work towards a degree in computer science and engineering. Marnie, on the other hand, was going in for psychology. She planned to go into child and family counseling so she could help people. Grace thought this was rather fitting for her. However, having such different majors unfortunately meant that they rarely had overlapping classes. So, as a result, Grace ended up taking a few psychology courses with Marnie to fill in her electives. Marnie would have happily returned the sacrifice and joined Grace in a computer science course, but she was already well into her advanced coding classes, and Marnie, bless her soul, had never been technology-prone beyond social media and smartphones. Throwing her bag over her shoulder, Grace scanned up and down the room to make sure she hadn't forgotten anything. When taking a moment to really appreciate it, it was quite the lovely room. Relatively large and spacious for being in the heart of a city, with an old cast-iron bay window that looked out onto the little trail that led back to the courtyard. Normally, the morning sun would leak through it, cascading their walls with soft pinks and blues. However, the heavy curtains and dusty screen Grace had pulled down the night prior closed out the exterior light. Seeing this, Marnie frowned and began to wrench them up and open, allowing the morning light to engulf the room. Today, however, there were no pinks or blues, only the murky grays of the dreary Seattle sky. "Oh my, turning into a vampire, are we?" she said through a chuckle. "Now wait a minute, I only drew the curtains because—" Grace retorted before being cut off. I get it. No need to explain. The light of day is just way too harsh on your delicate vampire eyes," Marnie sarcastically shot with a dramatic fainting gesture. "Hey, that's all right. I don't discriminate against the undead. Just promise to do me a solid and make sure not to bite Jack Stryker. Word through the grapevine is he's finally over his breakup with Aubrey, what's-her-face, and Mama's hungry." "Wait, which one of us was supposed to be the man-eating monster here?" Grace sneered as a cheeky grin split across her face. "I must say, it's so sweet of you to wait for the ex to stagger off before going in for the kill." "Of course! What kind of girl do you take me for?" Marnie playfully feigned offense, throwing her bag over her shoulder and pretending to march out of Grace's room in a huff. Within minutes, they were shuffling through the living room, past their small kitchen, and to the front door. Grace struggled with her keys for a moment before finally hearing the click of the lock and turning to catch up to Marnie, who was already halfway down the hall. The apartment complex they lived in was fairly old and built with indoor hallways that connected with different units. Despite its age, it was rather nice and was occupied mostly by fellow college students. It was a large red brick structure nestled in the lovely wooded block nearby the university's Greek Row. Most of the other buildings on the block were other apartment complexes and a few lovely old homes. Grace was hit with a pang of guilt, thinking of how, if it weren't for the generosity of Marnie's parents, she most certainly would not have been able to afford staying there. But before she could let herself wallow, Grace wiped the thought quickly from her mind, as she knew Marnie would have swiftly bopped her on the head for even thinking that way. Ceaselessly generous, that was her best friend. Grace made a mental note to make Jax's life a digital hell if he ever dared to hurt her. "What's up with that malicious little grin?" Marnie said as they marched out the front doors of the building. "Oh, nothing much. I was just thinking how very sorry Jax'll be if he turns you down," Grace replied through a devious giggle. "You're horrible," Marnie laughed in response, then winked with a smile. "Besides, you've really no reason to worry, Gracie. He'd be crazy to let a catch like me get away." The two giggled and joked the entire rest of the way to campus, until they found themselves cramming into their little auditorium seats and pulling out their testing materials. The room was large and noisy, with the dull roar of over 100 chatting students until the professor entered to the stage and dimmed the lights. Recognizing the cue, the room quickly went from a soft cacophony of chatter to a much more hushed lull of many frantic whispers as the inevitable test grew nearer. Grace and Marnie shared one last glance before looking up at the professor. Ready or not, it was the moment of truth. Grace steadied herself, reciting everything she had studied the night before once over in her mind. However, when she closed her eyes, she suddenly remembered the sight of those inky black eyes the night before. They bored into her. Even though she had dodged to the floor, she knew they had seen her. Seeing Grace go even paler, Marnie put a concerned hand on her shoulder. "Everything all right?" she whispered softly to her shaken friend. "Yeah, of course," Grace lied with a forced smile. "Just a little more freaked out about this test than I thought I'd be." Marnie gave her a reassuring smile before turning back to her own exam. "Well, I'm sure you'll be just fine. Well, see you at the finish line." Episode 3. A Familiar Stranger. Despite her moment of unease, Grace had managed to refocus herself on the exam, and 30 minutes later she set down her pencil, satisfied with her work. She looked to her left to see that Marnie had also finished her exam and had already begun packing up her things. Quietly, they wound their way to the front of the room and handed in their papers to the professor's aide. As they began to turn away, he called out for Marnie, stating that the professor wanted to talk to her. It was about her application to his personal capstone program, and he would appreciate it if she would hang around a few more minutes until the end of the class period. With an approving nod, Grace continued out of the auditorium and out onto the red square. The enormous plaza made of thousands of bright red bricks was abuzz with students. The slick material shone from the rain that had fallen while they were taking their test. Grace caught sight of several people slipping and nearly falling when they accidentally moved too quickly without paying attention. In hindsight, those bricks were probably not the best choice of material for a plaza set in one of the rainiest states in the country. With a strong gust of wind that nearly caused Grace herself to tumble, the rain began to pour once more. Cursing under her breath, she headed back toward the overhang outside of the lecture hall and planted herself on the bench beneath it. Digging through her bag, she sighed in relief at having remembered to pack her umbrella. She decided to wait on the bench a little longer so Marnie could walk with her. Marnie was always terrible at remembering her own umbrella, and the last thing she needed was to look like a drowned rat the day she wanted to make her move on Jax. Grace chuckled at the thought and began to people-watch the pedestrians attempting to cross the plaza. It was always a little sadistically entertaining to spectate the students who had forgotten their umbrellas playing the panicked game of try to run for cover but also try not to slip and look like an idiot, while chuckling at some poor soul who had the misfortune to bite it right in the center of a large puddle. Grace's eyes fell on a young man standing stock still amid the chaos. Despite the flurry of movement around him and the deluge from above, he remained perfectly still, seemingly oblivious to the pouring rain around him. What a weirdo. He shifted his gaze and locked eyes with Grace. For some reason, this unsettled her. Perhaps it was the way he reacted? He nearly did a double take and then stared into her eyes with an uncomfortable intensity. This made Grace uneasy, so she looked away. Common sense told her that the heavy rain had a distorting effect and that he probably had just mistaken her for someone else he knew, but she couldn't help but feel unnerved. Perhaps she owed her forming goosebumps to his peculiar looks. He had longer black hair than even her, nearly reaching his rear. Admittedly, this in itself wasn't that strange for Seattle. Young metalheads often sported such manes. No, that alone wasn't the cause for her unease. It was the fact that, despite the ferocious rain pouring down upon his head, he looked bone dry and perfectly in place, as if completely unfazed by the barrage of precipitation. Now, if this wasn't enough to make your average college student stare like a gaping idiot, it was his otherworldly eyes that did the trick. They were the most intense, icy blue she had ever seen. In fact, they were such a strange hue that she was almost certain he must have been wearing those colored contact lenses you often see people sporting around Halloween and at conventions. Judging from the distance away, he was quite tall and thin, at least 6 feet, probably a few inches more. Despite being incredibly pale, his face was well-defined and actually quite handsome. He was dressed head to toe in black and wrapped snugly in a long, tight-fitted, hooded pea coat of some sort. The two remained in their bizarre staring match until Grace finally forced herself to look back down to her bag and chuckle. So that's where her spooky night hallucination came from. She must have seen this man sometime before around on campus, and her sleep-deprived mind decided to make him the star of her boogeyman dream. The human brain sure was weird. Further suppressing another chuckle, Grace thought of how Marnie would have reacted if she had seen him. She'd positively have a heyday trying to convince Grace that he was a vampire. She ate that stuff up, after all. Ever since that novel set in Washington State got popular in middle school, Marnie was borderline obsessed with bloodsuckers, devouring every sexy undead fiend-themed novel that came out over the years. Vampire or not, the guy definitely gave off a really weird vibe. That fact in itself was strange, as, aside from the hair and eyes, he was actually quite ordinary. Sure, he wore all black and was wrapped in a strange and elaborate coat, but this was Seattle, and there were more than a few goths running around. Re-evaluating the situation, Grace came to the conclusion that, as far as the interesting characters this city had to offer, this fellow didn't even scratch the top 20. Finally settling on having just been acting silly, Grace decided to will herself into looking up at him again. If she caught his eye, she'd offer a friendly wave and hopefully break the awkward atmosphere that had built up. Taking a deep breath, she peered up, her eyes in his direction once more. But the young man was nowhere to be seen, apparently departed to some unknown destination. There was that feeling again. Honestly, she knew she shouldn't be so uneasy. After all, she was smack dab in the middle of a large college campus. The man probably had a class or something to get to. She was starting to be unreasonable. But still, she found her eyes scanning the square, subconsciously hoping to catch a last glimpse of where he might have run off to. But he was nowhere to be found. Wait a minute. How long had she been looking away? The square was quite enormous. Even on a day when the bricks were dry and easy to grip, it easily took her a good 2.5 to 3 minutes to cross. How quickly did he move? Just as she began to feel herself start to overanalyze things again, Grace felt a hand yank on her shoulder. Startled, she looked up to see Marnie grinning back at her. "What are you staring at with that sour face?" she asked brightly, now scanning the square herself. Grace hesitated for a moment, debating whether or not to bring it up to Marnie for fear of how silly it would sound being said out loud. She released a sigh and stood up from the cold stone bench. "Oh, nothing. Just people watching. We get to fire up the kilns and sculpting today, right?" she added at the end, hoping to distract Marnie with a quick subject change. It seemed to work because the cheerful brunette frowned and responded. "Well, we would have if Professor Madison hadn't emailed us that she's sick today. Didn't you read it? Looks like the rest of the day is ours." "Well, then I guess I didn't need to wait here for you after all," Grace playfully jabbed, lifting her umbrella up and acting as though she were about to walk away. "Now hold on just a minute," Marnie chased after her, careful not to slip on the bricks. "I'll still take you up on that. I cannot believe I still haven't learned better than to leave mine at home." "You want to hit the Ave for some lunch then?" Grace said, gesturing toward the busy shop-lined street at the far end of the square. "Hell yeah! Let me tell you, I'd commit terrible crimes for some teriyaki right about now," Marnie chirped mischievously as she scuttled under the umbrella. The two slipped and slid their way toward the little bridge that connected the square to the street below. The Ave was a busy street that was constantly bustling with students and packed with many restaurants and stores. Its close proximity to campus meant it almost always was buzzing with life, regardless of the weather. Everyone had their favorites, but Grace and Marnie were particularly fond of a little shop a few blocks down. It was easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking for, as the door was set into a narrow space between two other buildings. At first sight, it appeared to be nothing more than a little hole in the wall. But despite the unusual facade, what lied within was what the two assumed to be one of the best teriyaki shops in the district. They quickly wound their way through the narrow entrance. It was a peculiar layout. The first part of the building was what seemed to be a long, narrow hallway filled with a few tables occupied by happily chatting students. After a while, it led up a short flight of stairs and then opened into the rest of the restaurant. The space itself wasn't too large, but the owners had clearly done their best to be accommodating to the large number of students who visited and had crammed as many tables and chairs in as they comfortably could. There weren't many windows, with the exception of the wall by the back exit, but the building still felt bright nonetheless. It was kept warm and inviting by the countless event advertisements and full-length posters of the movies currently playing in the nearby theater plastered upon the walls. It was a bit eclectic, but what else, after all, would one expect from the heart of Seattle? Grace threw herself into a chair by the last open table and pushed her now soggy umbrella against the wall to dry. Marnie followed suit, taking the seat across from her and nestling in until their usual waitress, Kim, ran up to the table and handed them glasses of ice water. Kim was the daughter of the owner and was always a delight. She never failed to remember the orders of those who visited frequently and had gained a beloved reputation over the years. With a smile, Kim asked, "The usual?" Grace and Marnie responded with a grateful nod and proceeded to exchange a bit of pleasantries before Kim ran back to the kitchen. Grace poked at the ice in her drink with her straw before turning to Marnie. "So, what did the professor have to say about your application to his advanced program?" "Oh!" exclaimed Marnie, lighting up. "It's really exciting, Grace. He said so long as I complete an internship from an accredited facility this summer, I am guaranteed a spot next year." That's great, Grace smiled. You've really got a gift for that stuff, you know. Marnie beamed. I'd like to think so. My parents were so disappointed that I didn't go into the law program, but they're finally warming up to the idea of me pursuing psychology. I imagine especially so when I tell them I've been accepted into a really competitive senior program for it, too. After all, having something to brag to their friends about certainly does seem to brighten their moods. A dark cloud seemed to pass over Marnie's face, and Grace couldn't help but look away. For all the years she had spent dreaming about what it would have been like to grow up in Marnie's shoes, with rich and powerful parents, she hadn't really understood why Marnie was so fond of her own little house and family. Sure, they didn't really own anything impressive, but Grace and her parents had always been incredibly close. Meanwhile, Marnie seemed a bit disconnected from her own family, and it clearly weighed on her. The moment of silence was broken when Kim returned with their orders. They gratefully broke apart their chopsticks and began to devour their meals. Not long after, the atmosphere was cheery once more, and they found themselves laughing and gossiping as the rain continued to beat down outside. Grace sat facing the window on the back wall and could occasionally see a student or two shuffle past under an umbrella, or an unfortunate soul jogging by, hoping to dodge as many raindrops as possible. She took a sip from her drink, then looked up again. Her stomach tightened as she thought she saw the traces of a fancy black coat and long black hair whipping from sight past the window. She froze in place, staring intently, goosebumps rising on her skin. She was being silly again. She had to be. She just needed to calm down and ignore it. It was just another student passing by like all the others before. But Grace struggled to break her gaze, as if looking away would invite whoever it was to return. Wow, that sounded stupid. This whole thing was stupid. Hey, anyone home? Marnie mischievously chided. Oh, yeah, Grace sputtered, snapping back to reality. Sorry, just spacing out. It's been a really weird day. Marnie gave her a quizzical look, as if to ask for some elaboration. Grace shifted uncomfortably in her seat, internally debating whether or not it was worth bringing Marnie up to speed in everything that had happened. On the one hand, Marnie was her best friend, and she hated keeping secrets from her. But on the other, the last thing she wanted was her to worry. Or worse, have her affirm Grace's fears that she really was losing it. She muddled it over a moment longer before finally settling on telling Marnie a portion of the truth, of course omitting the bit about the strange dream. Well, I guess I may have been exaggerating a bit. It's not really been that weird of a day. I did see the super strange guy in the red square while you were talking to the professor, though. Strange guy? Like, good strange or bad strange? Was he cute? Did you get his number? It's about time you start seeing someone else. How long has it been since you and Logan broke up? 3 years now? 4? Good God, girl, time to get back in the game. Grace shot Marnie a warning look. Things had ended rather sourly between her and her last boyfriend. So badly, in fact, that she had sworn off dating entirely until she was finished with her education, and she didn't appreciate her friend bringing it up. No, not everyone is constantly checking out every guy with a pulse. I mean, I guess he wasn't all that bad looking, but he was totally creepy. Grace finished somewhat pathetically. Wait, so you're saying he was both hot and creepy? Like, what do you mean? Marnie furrowed her brow as if trying to imagine the scene. I don't know, Grace shot back truthfully. And I never said he was hot. He just had a nice face and whatnot, but that's not important. His eyes were totally freaky. They were this weird, unnatural-looking blue. It hardly looked human. They were probably just contacts. Those have been getting more and more popular, you know. They're super fashionable in Korea right now. I've actually been thinking about trying a pair myself, Marnie contemplated. Yeah, you're probably right, Grace conceded, impaling a piece of cabbage on her chopstick. Oh God, you should have seen his hair, Marn. Longer than mine, yet somehow he managed to keep it perfectly smooth and lustrous despite the disgusting wind and rain. Absolutely put me to shame. He must have been some kind of wizard. Good hygiene is a sure way to spot a winner. You totally should have gotten his number, Marnie playfully jabbed. At this, Grace flung a piece of cabbage at her, setting them off into a fit of laughter and marking their time to head back home. All right, well, those are the first 3 episodes to my series, Reapers the Deathly Messenger. Part 4 picks up with Sirens in the Rain. However, if you do want to continue the story, you are going to have to head over to Kindle Vella. Not to worry though, once again, I have it linked in the description below. And if you do make it over to Vella, I greatly appreciate thumbs up and ratings on my story, as that seriously helps me fight to stay relevant in the algorithm. After all, I'm competing with some pretty serious authors, and it's rough out there for a newbie. A huge thank you to those of you who have already started supporting this series, and if you want to keep connected with me on other platforms, I do also have a Facebook authors page, Katie O'Loughlin, so go ahead and look me up there if you want to stay connected on all my literary works. Alright guys, well that's all I've got time for today. Thank you so much for joining me, and until next time, stay creepy!